So let's start with Triumph of Surgery, class 10th. So ये है आपके footprints की book का, ठीक है? So I was really worried about Ricky this time. I had pulled my car up when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage, with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled out from his jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Harriot. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras. तो अभी क्या हो गया कि पहले तो the James Harriot is a doctor over here. ठीक है, अपने पास है 3 characters. First is Tricky, which is a small dog and is over pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. And his rich mistress is Mrs. Pumphrey. ठीक है, और तीसरे कैरेक्टर है डॉक्टर जेम्स हैरियट जो है हमारे ऑथर. ठीक है, तो उनका ही उन्होंने ही ये बोलते बोलते लिखा है लाइक आई वॉज रियली शॉक, मतलब द ऑथर और मिस्टर हैरियट वॉज रियली वरिड अबाउट ट्रिकी. ठीक है, सो हिज अभी आप देख सकते हो कि अगेन कैरेक्टर स्केच ऑफ ट्रिकी, हिज आईज ब्लड शॉट एंड र्यूमी, पानी पानी भर गया था उनकी आंखों, कुत्ते की आंखों में. फिर स्टेयर्ड स्ट्रेट अहेड एंड द उस डॉग का जो टंग था इट लॉर्ड फ्रॉम हिज जॉज. ठीक है, सो मिसेस पम्फ्री हिस्टेंड टू एक्सप्लेन, मतलब वो वरीडली एक्सप्लेन कर रही थी कि ही वॉज सो लिस्टलेस मिस्टर हैरियट, मतलब वो कितना लेजी हो गया था मिस्टर हैरियट. ही सीम टू हैव नो एनर्जी, उस पर ऐसा लग रहा था कि उसमें एनर्जी ही नहीं है. आई थॉट ही मस्ट बी सफरिंग फ्रॉम माल न्यूट्रिशन. अभी ब्लड शॉट र्यूमी आप देख सकते हैं कि फर्स्ट पैराग्राफ में हमें बोला गया है कि वो इतना यूजली फैट हो गया है वो डॉग, है ना, लाइक अ ब्लोटेड सॉसेज, मतलब पूरा भरा हुआ सॉसेज, पानी से भरा हुआ. सो विद अ लेग एट ईच कॉर्नर, यू कैन जस्ट इमेजिन. ठीक है, सो अभी वो उनकी मिस्ट्रेस बोल रही है कि शी थॉट ही वाज सफरिंग फ्रॉम माल न्यूट्रिशन, सो शी हैड बीन गिविंग हिम सम लिटिल एक्स्ट्रास बिटवीन द मील्स टू बिल्ड हिम अप, some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep, and nothing much really, ऐसा बोल रही है. ठीक है, तो वो बोल रही है कि मील्स के बीच बीच में ही ये सब एक्स्ट्रास चल रहे हैं. ठीक है, एंड अभी डॉक्टर पूछते हैं कि एंड डिड यू कट डाउन ऑन द स्वीट थिंग्स एज आई टोल्ड यू. Oh, I did it for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak that I had to relent. वो इतना वीक लग रहा था मुझे कि मुझे ये पूरा डाइट छोड़ना पड़ा. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog. This was the trouble. ठीक है, ये ट्रबल था उस छोटे डॉग का कि Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things that Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. ठीक है, अभी ये जो चीज़ें हैं वो मेंशन की हुई ना, और कितनी सारी चीज़ें होंगी, जैसे कि ऐसा आगे अगर हम बिस्किट खा रहे हैं, ऐसा देख लिया कोई डॉग को तो मन करता है राइट, 2 बिस्किट उसको भी दे दिया. तो इट माइट बी सो मेनी थिंग्स जो उन्होंने मेंशन भी नहीं की होंगी, है ना. सो अभी नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन डॉक्टर पूछते हैं कि आर यू गिविंग हिम प्लेंटी ऑफ एक्सरसाइज. अभी फिर से उनका रिप्लाई आता है मिसेस पम्फ्री का कि वेल ही हैज लिटिल वॉक्स विथ मी एज यू कैन सी, बट हॉटगिन द गार्डनर हैज बीन डाउन विथ लंबागो, सो देयर हैज बीन नो रिंग थ्रोइंग लेटली. अभी जो गार्डनर है उनका नाम है हॉटगिन, तो ही इज बीन डाउन विथ लंबागो. लंबागो यानी बैक पेन होता है. ठीक है, सो देर हैज बीन नो रिंग थ्रोइंग लेटली. एक रिंग होती है उसको थ्रो करते हैं तो डॉग्स लेके आते हैं, है ना, बहुत जगह देखा है हमने ये सब. तो दैट्स व्हाट, वो भी नहीं हुआ है. तो आई ट्राई टू साउंड सीवियर. नाउ आई रियली मीन दिस. इफ यू डोंट कट हिज फूड राइट डाउन एंड गिव हिम सम मोर एक्सरसाइज, ही इज गोइंग टू बी रियली इल. यू मस्ट हार्डन योर हार्ट एंड कीप हिम ऑन अ वेरी स्ट्रिक्ट डाइट. तो ये सब जो है स्ट्रिक्टली डॉक्टर मिस्टर हैरियट ने बोला. ठीक है, मिसेस पम्फ्री wrung her hands. wrung her hands मतलब ऐसे ऐसे करना. ठीक है, she wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriot. I'm sure you are right. But it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road. as if determined to put the new regime into the practice immediately. ऐसे वो head down करके आगे गई, इतना confidence में गई कि अभी की अभी जो भी डॉक्टर ने बोला है वो कर देंगे. ठीक है. I watched the progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. ठीक है, तो अभी डॉक्टर को लगने लगा कि बहुत ज़्यादा देर नहीं है कि अभी मिसेस पम्फ्री का फ़ोन आ सकता है. So फिर क्या हुआ? The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught, मतलब very very tensed and disappointed. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. बहुत ज़्यादा vomiting हो रही थी उसको. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting यानी हाफना. ठीक है. He didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. ठीक है, तो यहाँ पर आपको फिगर ऑफ स्पीच दिख रही है. डिडंट वांट टू गो फॉर वॉक्स, डिडंट वांट टू डू एनीथिंग. तो डिडंट वांट, ठीक है, तो डिडंट वांट टू भी आप ले सकते हैं, डिडंट वांट टू, ये जो भी तो है, दो सेम वर्ड्स एक ही लाइन में रिपीट होना, इसको हम लोग बोलते हैं रिपीटेशन. ठीक है. डिडंट वांट टू गो फॉर वॉक्स, डिडंट वांट टू डू एनीथिंग, दिस इज कॉल्ड रिपीटेशन. ठीक है. I had made my plans in advance. डॉक्टर ने plans बना लिए थे. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. क्यों? क्योंकि house में उसको over care कर रहे थे, over feed कर रहे थे, तो उस house से थोड़ा बाहर निकालते हैं उसको. ठीक है. तो I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight. Fortnight यानी 14 days, 2 weeks. ठीक है. To be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned, मतलब टेंशन हो गया उनको, वरी हो गया. ठीक है. She was sure that he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it was the best way to save him and to take him without any delay. And followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings यानी जोर से रोना और चिल्लाते हुए रोना, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in the blanket. The entire staff was roused and maids rushed in and out bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all that stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of coats. ठीक है, उन्होंने armful of coats जो है through the window she threw inside into the car. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping by my seat. ठीक है, by my side. I patted the head and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. At the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided that he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. I made up a bed for him in the warm loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. Second day पे क्या हुआ कि थोड़ा interest दिखाने लग गया वो dog अपने surroundings में, और third day पे जब भी कोई dog का आवाज आता था वो whimper, मतलब जाकर देखना, interest दिखाना. ठीक है. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. ठीक है. So ये सब dogs की breeds हैं. So after rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. ठीक है. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. ठीक है. So Tristan is his assistant, जो food serve करते हैं. There was the usual headlong rush. followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining balls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. ठीक है? So he discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, squashed every few minutes. ठीक है? तो अभी क्या हो गया? वो dog एकदम active हो गया. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky object among the shaggy crew. ठीक है, क्योंकि उसको बहुत पैम्पर किया गया था, राइट? उसको रोज नहलाते थे, नए कपड़े पहनाते थे, तो इसलिए वो क्या था, सिल्की ऑब्जेक्ट बन गया था वो among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at the meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. ठीक है, सो ही हैड नेवर सच अ टाइम, है ना, इसको इतना पैम्पर करके रखा था कि वो लोग बोलते थे कि नहीं, मेरा डॉग रैट क्यों खाएगा, है ना, ही हैज सोफिस्टिकेटेड फूड, तो इतना मिसेस पम्फ्री ने उसको पैम्पर करके रखा था. ठीक है, सो ऑल द वाइल मिसेस पम्फ्री hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions, मतलब मैंने ऐसे questions को ignore मार दिया. ठीक है, about whether his cushions were being changed regularly or his correct coat was worn according to the weather. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger. ठीक है, and was convalescing rapidly. Convalescing मतलब healing. The word convalescing seemed to do something with Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round, fresh eggs, two dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. ठीक है, तो जो भी ट्रिकी के लिए भेजा जा रहा था वो सब मिस्टर हैरियट और वो सब उनके असिस्टेंट्स या फ्रेंड्स एंजॉय कर रहे थे. ठीक है, सो वी कुड हार्डली बिलीव इट व्हेन द ब्रांडी केम टू put a final edge on the Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. They were the days of deep content, starting well with an extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt forced to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. ठीक है, तो within minutes about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her, her lips trembling. "Oh, Mr. Herriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn. In the midst, ears flapping, tail wagging, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled dog. Lithe यानी strong or thin. Hard-muscled dog. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "Oh!" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. During this excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, bowls, etc. None of them which had been used. ठीक है, कुछ भी यूज नहीं हुआ था, right? क्योंकि ट्रिकी यहाँ पर एंजॉय कर रहा था with his dog friends. ठीक है. So as the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriot," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." By James Harriot. Thank you.